Thank you very much for that introduction, John. And you should all have two handouts. So if you don't have a list of inscriptions or a list of pieces of evidence and a bibliography, there's some at the front here. So I don't mind if you want to come up and get them. Sometime between the middle and the end of the 4th century BC, a group of people describing themselves only as hoi plunes, the people of the washing trough, or the washers or fullers, dedicated this monument to the nymphs and all the gods. This is number 14 on the handout. Above the inscription, we can see sculpted in relief the face of the river god Achelous, 3 nymphs, and a seated Pan. Below it are a bearded figure, perhaps a hero, and on the other side of a small altar, Persephone and a seated Demeter. In the inscription itself, the names of all those who made the dedication are listed, and beside probable citizens such as Socrates, the son of Polycrates, not that Socrates, we find Zoagoras and Zocrepus, almost certainly foreigners from Cyprus, Leuce and Myrine, undoubtedly women, and Midas, very likely a slave. Whoever these washers were, the monument they dedicated has become a key piece of evidence in an ongoing debate about the nature of the classical Athenian democracy. As long ago as 1999, Nicholas Jones argued that Athens' associations, its religious, kinship, and civic societies, provided a corrective to the exclusiveness of the democracy's central institutions by integrating individuals who found themselves outside of the charmed circle of male citizenship. In an essay first published in 2000, Josh Ober presented his own picture of an increasingly liberal Athens, in which nearly 2 centuries of democracy eventually started to break down the divisions that separated citizens from non-citizens. Ober was concerned with ideology, and he drew his evidence from literary texts, but in recent years, younger scholars have again turned our attention to the epigraphic evidence which had provided the foundation for Jones's claims. Claire Taylor has pointed to the co-presence of citizens and non-citizens in a range of inscriptions, and Alex Gottesman, in his book Politics and the Street in Democratic Athens, has made an attempt to gather together all the evidence that citizens and non-citizens were members of the same associations in classical times. Now, these 2 recent contributions are part of a broader movement to look beyond the central political institutions of the polis for social, religious, and civic spaces in which the binaries of male and female, Athenian and foreigner, free and slave, begin to break down. Kostas Vlasopoulos has speculated about possible interactions between the citizens and foreigners that lived in the same neighborhoods in the Piraeus, and Sarah Weima and others have emphasized the participation of medics and other non-citizens in some of Athens' religious festivals. In this paper, I want to do 3 things. Firstly, I will present a list of all the evidence that has been claimed to show that citizens and non-citizens were part of the same associations, and talk about why we should be cautious about various items on the list. Secondly, I will argue that the evidence only becomes both plentiful and reliable in the period after the classical democracy has started to decline, and suggest that the inclusion of non-citizens in Athens associations should be viewed as a Hellenistic phenomenon rather than a classical one. Finally, I will put forward an explanation of why non-citizens start appearing in Athenian associations only in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, when the democracy was undergoing a long, fitful, but eventually terminal decline. Before we look at the evidence, though, it is worth being aware of the slipperiness of the terms in my title. Whether we think there were non-citizens in associations will depend on what we mean by non-citizens, associations, and even in. What kind of groups count as associations, and what does it mean for someone to be included in one? We will have to come back to these questions once we have looked at the evidence, and become more familiar with the kinds of groups and the kinds of belonging that have left traces in our records. But I can state at the outset that I use the term citizen here to refer to someone with political rights. Robin Osborne and Josine Bloch have recently argued that this is a peculiarly Aristotelian sense of the Greek word polites, which could be used to refer to anyone who took part in the community, even women. And that may well be the case. However, much of the interest of the scholarship I have just mentioned is in its attempt to find evidence of some sort of participation by people who were excluded from the democracy's central institutions. And I find the English word citizen a convenient way of distinguishing those who had political rights from those who did not. So for the purposes of this presentation, the word citizen means someone with political rights. Let's take a look now at the list on the handout. I have included in it all the inscriptions and passages from literary texts cited by Jones, Taylor, Gottesman, and a few other scholars in support of the idea that citizens and non-citizens mingled in Athenian associations. I've also supplemented it with some inscriptions mentioned in a useful article on Hellenistic associations by Elias Arnautoglu. I have ordered the pieces of evidence chronologically using the best and most recent dates I could find, and I've quoted most of the possible references to non-citizens from the various pieces of evidence. Finally, I've recorded which type of non-citizens appear. In normal type, when the presence of a certain sort of person is certain, or virtually certain, in italics when it's probable or likely, and underlined when it's only a possibility. Before drawing any conclusions from this evidence, I'll have to make a series of disclaimers. Quite a long one, actually, most of the talk. I will start with a broad disclaimer and then move on to more specific reasons for caution. The broad reason to be cautious with this list is that in most cases, the attributions of citizen status are uncertain. Normally, I have only listed citizens as certain when they are listed with their demotic, the deme they were official members of. I've only listed medics as certain if they are listed with the official formula resident in such and such a deme, oikon en, and I've only listed foreigners as certain if they appear with their ethnics, the name of the city-state that they came from. But as Taylor notes, such indications are often lacking from dedications made by groups, especially in the 4th century. As a result, scholars often resort to assumptions, inevitably, that someone with a name that isn't common among slaves must be a citizen, for example. To make matters even worse, the whole idea of identifying people's statuses on the basis of their names has recently come under attack by Velsopoulos, whose detailed analysis has revealed that, and I quote, the majority of Athenian slaves bore names that did not distinguish them from citizens. At least with women, we are on somewhat firmer ground, with a number of names having characteristically feminine forms. But inferring an individual's status from their names is a perilous business, and my labeling of the evidence according to levels of certainty is meant as a way of acknowledging that. Arnautoglu backs up his claims for non-citizen presence in associations with detailed references to the number of free, foreign, or servile individuals that are attested with the same name. And I've tried to follow his lead by marking as probable or only possible medics, for example, people that share their names with a large or small number of other medics. So after this general disclaimer, we have to move on to some more specific ones for the different categories of evidence of which this list is composed. We can start with Jones's claims about citizens and non-citizens mixing in what he calls the territorial deme. Jones claims that, besides the constitutional deme that was limited to citizens, there was a territorial deme in which citizens mixed with other non-citizen residents of the area, women, slaves, and medics. He argues that we can see these non-citizen residents on inscriptions referred to simply as the residents, hoi oikuntes, a term which he thinks recalls the official term for metics, who were registered as being resident in, oikon en, certain demes. An example is number 1 on the handout, which refers to the demesmen and those resident in Ikarion. But, as Jones later admits, those resident probably refers to Athenian citizens from other demes who are living in Ikarion, and not to non-citizens. We can say the same for most of Jones's other examples. Number 32, for example, mentions the deme and those resident in Rhamnus, but those resident are again probably Athenian citizens from other demes, and not medics or slaves. As it happens, a number of inscriptions that I haven't quoted make clear that this is what they mean by writing something like those among the citizens who are resident, or those among the Athenians who are resident. There's only one case where I think that Jones is right, and the text does mention non-citizens, and that's number 29, with its reference to the Rhamnusians and the other Athenians, and all of those resident in Rhamnus. Now here, of course, since the other Athenians must refer to Athenian citizens from other demes, the phrase all of those resident in Rhamnus must refer to other people, and that's probably non-citizens. But just notice for the moment the late date of that decree, 236/5. Another category of evidence appealed to by Jones is decrees produced jointly by demesmen and garrisons, or soldiers stationed in garrisons. Here the problem is that there were both Athenian and foreign soldiers stationed at garrisons at various points during the late 4th and 3rd centuries, and we rarely know for sure what kind of soldiers were present when a given decree was inscribed. So when, as in number 16, honors are granted by the demesmen and the soldiers, it is impossible to tell whether the soldiers in question were Athenian citizens on garrison duty, or Macedonians, i.e. foreigners, charged with keeping the Athenians under control. In a few cases, it seems clear that the soldiers are in fact foreigners. Look at number 30, for example. We have to trust the restorations of some key words in this case, but similar sentences on other documents make them pretty secure. And if we do trust them, we have here a clear contrast between those of the citizens stationed in Eleusis and those foreigners stationed with Gnosios. So there is some kind of citizen-non-citizen interaction going on here. But note, again, the date of this inscription, after 236/5. I'll explain why I think the chronology is so important in just a second. A second group of items for which disclaimers should be given is made up of passages from Andocides' speech on the mysteries, in which the orator implicated a number of individuals in the profanation of the mysteries and the desecration of the Hermes. Numbers 2 to 4 on the handout. The names of the men denounced in Andocides' speech were carefully assembled into hetaireai, or political clubs, in a 1974 work by Olivier Orange. Orange's hetaireai contain a number of non-citizens, a few of which were definitely involved in acts of sacrilege, although a number of others disappear upon closer inspection. Consider Agariste, for example, who I've listed in number 3 on the handout as a possible female member of the hetaireai of Alcibiades. She's only a possible female member because all that Andocides tells us about her is that she knew where the mysteries were parodied. And obviously, she could have known where that act of sacrilege took place without having taken part in it herself. More importantly, though Andocides tells us that all these individuals were implicated in the sacrilege, it's less certain that they were members of formal associations called hetaireai. Whether Andocides himself was part of a hetaireai, in fact, seems to have been a live issue at his trial. The orator uses the word only once in his speech in denying that he was part of one. In any case, the formal status of various groups of people is another point that we will come back to. While we're dealing with the literary evidence, we should also consider number 10 on the handout. This deals with the trial of Phryne, the famous courtesan who, according to Athenian, so not very reliable, was acquitted of a capital charge only after baring her breasts to the jurors, hence the vivid illustration. Now, what's interesting for our purposes is that Phryne is also said to have organized mixed theasoi, that is, religious societies involving both men and women. Gottesman and others have naturally appealed to this as evidence for mixed associations. Unfortunately, I think the evidence is a bit weaker than has been supposed. For a start, the allegation comes from an anonymous rhetorical treatise from the 2nd century AD. Its unknown author is called Seguerianus, after Nicolas Seguier, the French scholar who discovered the text in the 19th century. Many scholars have assumed that the second sentence quoted in number 10 is in fact a quotation from a prosecution speech that was delivered by Euthias at the trial, but maybe not written by Euthias. This sentence, in any case, repeats the allegation that Phryne held an improper sort of theasoi. Now, there are many reasons why we should be skeptical of this evidence. What it boils down to is one sentence from the lost written version of a speech, quoted, we assume, some 400 years later by an unknown author. In any case, we might also doubt whether either of the sentences in number 10 clearly asserts that Phryne was convening mixed theasoi, as opposed to separate theasoi for men and women. The possibility of parallel groups of this sort is something else we will be coming back to. We can complete our discussion of the literary evidence by looking now at numbers 11 and 12 on the handout, two passages of Demosthenes that have also been highlighted by Gottesman. The first, number 11, is simply an allegation that Aeschines' mother Glaucothea held theasoi of a sort that led to the death of another priestess. Now, if we follow the Scholias, the reference here is to a woman called Ninon, who was convicted either of mixing love potions or of parodying the mysteries. So if the implication is that Glaucothea was doing the same sort of thing, this would be evidence that she was mixing love potions or parodying the mysteries, and not that she was holding mixed theasoi. The next item, number 12, is a little better, since at least here there is a clear implication that men and women attended the same theasoi. But the passage is a vivid piece of hyperbole designed to discredit Demosthenes' bitterest rival. And though we are told that Aeschines was given the offices of president and chairman and ivy bearer and basket bearer, the titles are clearly parodic. Besides which, there is one further issue we might want to raise before using any of these passages as evidence for mixed associations. The force of all these passages relies on the idea that mixed theasoi were regarded as highly improper. The possible Euthias fragment even calls them illegal, ekthesmus. In view of that, are these passages really evidence that mixed associations were common in the classical period, or that they were seen as something strange or even beyond the pale? It may be, in other words, that the reason Demosthenes makes so much of the rumor that Aeschines has been attending his mother's Thiasoi is precisely because such groups were normally limited to people of a single sex. That there were parallel associations for Athenians and non-Athenians was established long ago by William Ferguson. The same thing may well be true for men and women. In any case, we should be careful not to assume that groups with non-citizens in them also had citizens in them, and hence were mixed associations, when they may simply have been composed entirely of non-citizens. Number 9 and number 10 on the handout, for example, have usually been assumed to have been inscribed by groups composed entirely of slaves. Not only are many of the names attested as slave names, but the inscriptions in question were found near Lavrion, with its large population of slaves employed in the silver mines. Something similar might be going on with another group of items, the so-called Phialae inscriptions. Gottesman cites the entire category of Phialae inscriptions as evidence for mixed associations. In fact, as Elizabeth Meyer makes clear in her detailed study of these documents, only a small number of them even mention associations. And when I looked through these myself, I found that only 2 of these mention non-citizens, and these 2 inscriptions are numbers 17 and 18 on your handout. Both of these items contain a certain reference to a metic, I admit that, identified by the formula resident in oikon en, and a certain reference to a koinon eraniston, literally a community of lenders, or a credit association. Now, it's perfectly possible that these credit associations consisted entirely of metics, in which case there would be no chance of using these inscriptions as evidence for mixed associations. But even if they consisted entirely of citizens, what kind of interaction would they show? These 2 inscriptions would show that 2 credit associations joined forces with a metic in escaping, as the inscriptions say, and escaping, we don't know what that means, probably escaping from prosecution. Perhaps the man named was some sort of officer within the credit association. If so, he raises yet another question we will soon return to, I promise. Whether we should count an individual holding a special status in a group as an especially well-integrated member of it, or as someone whose difference was deliberately emphasized. Consider the case of priestesses, for example. We have a number of inscriptions produced by demes that mention priestesses, or honor priestesses even. These are helpfully listed by Jones. At the same time, we know that women could not be formal members of demes, since that would grant them the right to participate in the polis's central institutions, and we have no evidence that that ever happened. And it may be that some of the inscriptions here reflect a similar situation, where associations contract in a woman to serve as a celebrant or a priest without integrating her as a member of the group in any other way. In number 34, for instance, a priestess called Glaucon is honored by a group of Orgiones, but we may wonder whether they would describe her as one of them. And what can we say about the position of Demo, the plerotria, or collector of number 19? As Edward Harris describes it, the collector was the person who collected the contributions of the Eranos loan, handed over money to the borrower, and administered the terms of the loan. So she probably should be treated as a member of a credit association. As for Nikippe, the pro-Eranistria of number 33, she is honored alongside 3 men, which suggests that at least that the group saw them all as having comparable status. All right, so we've now finally reached the end of my disclaimers, at which point you would be forgiven for thinking that the list I have presented is so hedged round with doubt that it cannot possibly tell us much. In fact, it can tell us a number of things, but what it tells us depends on what questions we are asking. I said I'd come back to the issue of definitions after we'd looked at the evidence, and now is the time to do so. I said that what we meant by non-citizens and associations would depend on what we meant by non-citizens, associations, and in. I've already said what I mean by citizen, someone with political rights. Now we should turn to the question of what we mean by an association, and what we mean by involvement in an association. Since these 2 questions can be answered in so many possible and sensible ways, I preferred to leave the question open for a bit longer, and to see what conclusions the evidence will allow us to support. We can first distinguish several different standards for what counts as an association, each of which is more demanding than the last. At the weakest level, an association is simply any bunch of people mentioned together, without there being any indication that they're in a formal club with officers, a sense of its own history, and so on. In this category, we should probably place our washers in number 14, as well as these guys, hoide, whoever they are, who dedicated number 8. Then there are those groups whose internal structures we know nothing about, or whose corporate status is uncertain. Here I am thinking of the Hetairai, constructed by Olivier Orange, and I'm also thinking of the decrees produced jointly by demes and garrisons. At the strongest level, an association is a well-established group with a formal membership, officers and celebrants, priests and so on, as well as some sort of institutional endurance over time. And this is where we should place the demes that feature in our list, as well as many of the thiasoi and orgiones, groups of orgiones, I should say. We can also differentiate several different standards for what counts as the inclusion of a non-citizen in an association. To start once again with the weakest level, we might count indications of any sort of joint action by citizens and non-citizens as a kind of association, or at least a kind of cooperation. Here I am again thinking of our washers, who washed and dedicated one inscription together, so far as we know, and who may never have done anything else together at all. And I'm thinking of the joint decrees of demesmen and soldiers, such as number 37, where the Rhamnusians and the soldiers stationed in the garrisons came together to praise and crown Sopolis, but may never have joined forces before or after that occasion for any other purpose. Then there's a middle level, where cooperation is clearly going on, but we cannot tell if non-citizens are treated as ordinary members rather than special cases. And this is where I think we should place the inscriptions involving priestesses. At the strongest level, we have those pieces of evidence that suggest that citizens and non-citizens came together regularly and cooperated with one another on an equal basis. The last 4 inscriptions on this list, which consist of lists of members, are good examples of this. The value of distinguishing between these different standards of evidence is that it allows us to see more clearly what kinds of claims can be supported. We can start by setting our parameters to the weakest settings and counting as cooperation any kind of joint activity, and by treating any old bunch of people as an association. Since these are more or less the criteria that I used for making my list, all of the inscriptions count, and we have no fewer than 44 pieces of evidence. This may seem like a lot of evidence, but what kind of historical claims will this evidence actually support? Here is one. Citizens and non-citizens cooperated in some way during the late classical and Hellenistic periods. And that's interesting as far as it goes, and it's definitely supported by the evidence, but it's so weak that it's uncertain whether anyone ever doubted it. Citizens and non-citizens must have interacted in some way in democratic Athens. After all, they inhabited the same space in the same period. The real question, though, for social historians is what forms their interaction took, and we should be open to the possibility that differences in status led to invisible lines being drawn between people in certain contexts. Consider Socrates is mentioned at the beginning, the real Socrates. Consider Socrates is mentioned at the beginning of the Republic of a festival of Bendis in the Piraeus, at which there would be 2 separate processions, one of locals and one of Thracians. Now, Gottsman takes this as evidence of what he calls the integrative character of the festival. But the fact that the Athenians and the Thracians were in different processions, even while worshipping the same god at the same festival, might in fact point to a different conclusion, namely that distinctions of status were in fact taken quite seriously. We know from Ferguson's work that parallel religious associations for Athenians and foreigners were a feature of early Hellenistic Athens, so the festival mentioned by Socrates is not an isolated incident, which might in turn imply that the invisible line that divided the Thracians and Athenians at the festival of Bendis was one that had an enduring existence. It is against this background that the claim that citizens and non-citizens could be part of the same associations is so interesting, because it would suggest that Athenian society, at least in some cases, did manage to transcend or work around the barriers that controlled access to the city's political institutions. So to avoid that claim being drained of most of its interest, I myself would be in favor of applying quite strong standards to the evidence. In other words, I would want to find good evidence of citizens and non-citizens both having ordinary membership in formal, enduring, and identifiable associations in the classical period. Now that may not sound like I'm setting too stringent a requirement, but it will quickly be found that it in fact excludes much of the evidence on our list. The first certain attestation of citizens and non-citizens together comes from number 4 on the handout, dealing with the events of 415. But as we have seen, it may be doubted whether this list of individuals implicated in acts of sacrilege, was really a hetaireia. The next piece of evidence which has confirmed cases of both citizens and non-citizens is number 24, which comes from the year 272/1, and in which a religious society honors its priestess and her citizen husband. But we might wonder whether a priestess was considered an ordinary member of an association on a level with the other members. If we do have that worry, our first confirmed instance of a non-citizen as an ordinary member of an association, otherwise of citizens, would be Nikon of Astikos, who shows up in number 31, a list of worshippers of Piraeus from sometime after 229. And if we're really fussy and want several definite citizens and non-citizens appearing as full members of the same association, we'll have to do only with the last 4 items on the list, which are dated to between 159 and around 50 BC. Now at this point, I might be fairly accused of being much too skeptical. And admittedly, there are a number of positions that might be taken up that fall short of the extreme skepticism that I've arrived at, and which don't do too much violence to the evidence. But instead of defining and defending one such position with detailed reference to the text of various inscriptions, I want to draw out more fully a broader feature of the evidence that has already partially emerged in the discussion that I've just had. This is that the evidence is slanted towards the Hellenistic period. 24 of our 44 pieces of evidence cannot possibly be from the classical period. A further 8 might well not be from the classical period, meaning that a full 32 of our 44 pieces of evidence, or 73% of it, might well come from after the end of the classical democracy. And this leaves only 12 pieces of evidence that were definitely produced during the classical democracy. Moreover, the quality of the evidence tends, in my opinion, to improve over time. The 12 pieces of evidence that are definitely classical are very dubious, consisting as they do of deme inscriptions that probably don't show non-citizen involvement, literary evidence that's unreliable, and dedications from Lavrion, probably by groups that consisted entirely of slaves. The only piece of evidence that's definitely classical and not from a slightly dubious category of evidence is number 6. Hoide, I think, is that the one? And in this case, we unfortunately, it's the one with the question mark for the name of the group. And in this case, we unfortunately have no idea what kind of group the list of names belong to. On the other side of the ledger, all of the 4 inscriptions that definitely list multiple citizens and non-citizens as members of the same association come from after 159 BC, so they're very late. Finally, if we count names rather than pieces of evidence, there are many more non-citizens from the 3rd and 2nd centuries than from the 4th, since we have more inscriptions containing lists of non-citizens the later that we get. Now we should recall at this point that most of these pieces of evidence have been cited by scholars trying to show that there were mixed associations during the classical democracy. And that, of course, means before 321, when the Macedonian regent Antipater imposed a property requirement for political participation that marked the end of the system set up by Cleisthenes around 508/7. But we have just seen that the majority of the relevant evidence cannot possibly be from this period, and a great majority of it is probably not from this period. We are therefore left with 2 alternatives. The first is that there were mixed associations throughout the classical period, but they failed to show up in the evidence until later. And the second is that mixed associations are in fact largely a phenomenon of the Hellenistic period. Now, Gottesman is a good example of someone who fully embraces the first possibility. His view is, in his own words, that mixed associations existed already in the 4th century, but they only make their presence felt in the epigraphic record in the 3rd century. Very reasonable view. For this idea to be convincing, though, we would want to have some account of why mixed associations only turn up in the epigraphic record when they do, if they really existed for a long time before that. And I've come across 3 possible stories as to how this might have happened. The first possibility is suggested by Jones, who claims or who says that our inscriptions for non-citizens' involvement are weighted towards the Hellenistic period because all of our inscriptions are weighted towards the Hellenistic period. In other words, we have more inscriptions at the very end of the classical period than we have from before. And that's true. In fact, as Charles Hedrick has shown, the number of surviving inscriptions from Athens peaks in the 4th century BC. Unfortunately, Hedrick also shows that the number of surviving inscription declines more or less steadily in the 3rd, the century to which almost 40% of the inscriptions on our list definitely date from. Moreover, the number of inscriptions produced by the various sorts of associations also declines through the 3rd century. The number of inscriptions produced by Demes peaks in the late 4th century, but collapses in the course of the 3rd, so much so that by the beginning of the 2nd century, the record is dried up entirely. Thiassoi turn up in inscriptions from the mid-5th century on, but disappear by the end of the 3rd century. And groups of orgiones are attested from the 4th century on, but they vanish by the mid-2nd century. So we don't have more evidence for non-citizens and inscriptions in the 3rd century just because we have more inscriptions in general or more inscriptions from associations. In fact, we have less of both of these types of evidence. And at the same time, we have more evidence for non-citizens. The second possibility is one suggested by William Ferguson. Ferguson pointed to the repeal in 306 of a law proposed by one Sophocles of Sunion, attempting to establish state supervision over associations. The repeal of this law, to use Gottesman's paraphrase, set a precedent creating a right of association for many groups that before this could not express their solidarity publicly. The problem with the notion that mixed associations start being open about their activities only after the repeal of the law of Sophocles is that no fewer than 21 of the items on our list likely predate the repeal of the law. Some 32% of them are inscriptions set up in public by the various groups, none of which seems particularly secretive. On the contrary, many of them consist of lists of members. So there's no reason to believe that the repeal of Sophocles' law opened the lid on associations that had previously been unable to express themselves. As far as we can tell, associations begin to express themselves much earlier than that, and they begin to include non-citizens from the late 4th century on. So we need a theory that explains the emergence of mixed associations in the last quarter of the 4th century, not after 306 BC. The third possibility was put forward by Marie-Françoise Bazelet. Bazelet's theory accords better with the chronology of the evidence, since she dates the pickup in inscribing by associations to the middle of the 4th century. And she thinks that at this point, a longer-term tendency by the state to gain more control over associations caused these groups to start to publicize their activities, to show that they were no threat to the democratic state. To quote Gottesman's paraphrase again, by displaying their activities through public inscriptions, associations sought to demonstrate their adherence to polis-wide norms and practices. Now, unfortunately, I'm not sure that many of the inscriptions on our list show associations going to great pains to do this. Certainly, they don't hide their democratic mode of organization. The prescripts of a few of them imitate the formal language used at the beginning of decrees passed by the assembly, for example. But this is always only as a preface to the real business of the decree, which is usually something very different, honoring a benefactor, say. If the chief purpose of these associations had been to publicize their democratic credentials, surely they could have done so directly instead of inscribing honorary decrees which only mention matters of procedure in passing. Gottesman's attempt to use later evidence to say something about the classical period is perfectly understandable. After all, ancient historians are often reduced to filling in gaps in our sources by the intelligent use of later material. And there's nothing to rule out the idea that mixed associations did exist throughout the classical period and that the evidence has simply failed to survive. On the other hand, given the paucity of the evidence for mixed associations in classical times, it's equally and perhaps more likely that the mixed association is not a classical phenomenon at all, but a Hellenistic one. So let's now consider the second alternative. If the mixed association is a Hellenistic phenomenon, what might explain that? And I'll look at two theories, those of Jones and of Ober, before offering my own. Now, we might be slightly surprised to meet Jones again here, since we just considered his argument that the mixed association was a classical phenomenon and only looks like a Hellenistic one because of the nature of the surviving evidence. By the end of his book, though, Jones has, laudably enough, changed his mind and has decided that the mixed association really did emerge in the Hellenistic period. He then suggests an explanation as to why this was so. And what he says is, all groups whose members qualified by descent were doomed to stagnation, if not gradual decline, for demographic reasons. And what he means is that as the lines of descent of established families came to an end, membership of associations gradually sank to zero. But as these groups declined, according to Jones, other groups, Erinoi, Thiassoi, groups of Orgiones, emerged or became more active. And these often worshipped foreign gods, according to Jones, and because of this, many of them incorporated foreign members into their ranks. Now, it's true that many of the pieces of evidence on our list were produced by religious groups, 25 of the 44, in fact, or well more than half of the total. But only 9 of these are groups that were dedicated to foreign deities, and a full 7 of these were devoted to the Mother of the Gods, who had a shrine in the form of the Matroon in the Athenian Agora from at least the 5th century, and so is only dubiously foreign by the 3rd century. Moreover, at least 15 of the items on our list, more than a third, don't involve religious associations at all. So it probably wasn't the foreign and religious nature of these groups that led to the involvement of foreigners in them, since not many of them were religious, and a few of them were dedicated to genuinely foreign gods. And in any case, Jones's theory does nothing to explain the increasing involvement of women, slaves, and freed individuals, as well as foreigners. Now, the problem with Jones's idea that it was largely associations that were new to Athens that was driving the increase in non-citizens is that only some of the associations we were dealing with were actually new. Some of them were. Number 41 is in fact our earliest surviving inscription from a synodos, for all we know, a genuinely new type of religious association. But some of these associations had been around for some time, but only started incorporating non-citizens in the Hellenistic period. Consider Thiassoi, for example. We know they exist from at least the mid-5th century on, and we have a few lists of members, an inscribed table, for example, but there's no indication of any non-citizen presence. Then, as a glance at the handout will show, we have more and more attestations of non-citizens in Thiassoi from around the late 4th century on. So the problem is precisely that we have old associations from the classical period that seem to become more open to non-citizens in Hellenistic times. So what might explain this? And this is where it might be profitable to bring in Ober's theory about the liberalizing effects of Athenian democracy. Ober suggests that the citizen-non-citizen boundary was gradually blurred over the course of the 4th century because the democracy broke down inherited ideas about who deserved to take part in politics. Once the idea that political participation should be restricted to the rich or well-born had been shown to be absurd, the idea that non-citizens should be excluded from other spheres of life began to seem similarly careworn. That's Ober's idea. And Ober appeals to a range of texts, beginning with the Old Oligarchs, Constitution of the Athenians, written in the 420s, and ending with Aristotle's Politics, written in the 330s or 320s. So in terms of chronology, using Ober's theory to explain mixing and associations would work quite well for the first 13 or 14 items on our list. The problem is what we do with the rest of the list, which suggests that there's also evidence, and increasing amounts of evidence, of citizen-non-citizen interaction at the end of the 4th century and afterwards. And it would seem unlikely that democratic ideology was driving the increasing inclusion of non-citizens in associations in the 3rd century, because the 3rd century is a time in which Athenian democracy was far from stable. Many of our pieces of evidence for mixed associations come from periods in which the sovereignty of the people can be described as uncertain at best. Numbers 21 to 23 come from the period conventionally known as the tyranny of Lachares. Maybe we should call it primacy, but anyway, it comes from a period of domination by one citizen. And numbers 26 to 30 come from the period of oligarchic rule imposed by Antigonus Gonatas in the wake of Athens' defeat in the Chremonidean War. And, of course, as Volker Grieb and others have recently reminded us, the decline of the democracy was a long and complex process, and in the wake of many non-democratic regimes imposed by Macedon were a number of successful democratic restorations. There was also considerable institutional continuity, with the assembly and the council continuing to function deep into Hellenistic times. On the other hand, on 2 occasions, 321 and 317, the number of citizens allowed to participate in politics was reduced to a point well below classical levels. And on that second occasion, state pay for attendance in the assembly, the courts, and the theater, crucial in enabling poor Athenians to participate in politics, was abolished by Demetrius of Phaleron, the Macedon-backed regent. On the whole, there is no doubt, at least in my mind, that democracy in Athens was considerably weaker around 200 than it had been around 325. The picture presented by the evidence, in which non-citizens become increasingly visible in associations just as Athenian civil society and democracy declines, is not, I think, one that Ober's theory of the liberalizing effect of democratic ideology can explain. Besides being simultaneous with the decline of the democracy, the emergence of non-citizens in association also happens just as the associations themselves begin to disappear. Rather than going from strength to strength, their ranks swollen with non-citizens eagerly collaborating with citizens for the first time, most of the classical associations survive only a few decades after they start incorporating outsiders. The inclusion of non-citizens thus starts to look less like the beginning of something new than a last gasp. This surprising situation is what needs to be explained, and it's here, speaking of last gasps, that I turn to my own theory, for which we will have to travel briefly to Vermont. Frank Bryan, in his study of direct democratic town meetings in New England, noticed that members of smaller communities were more likely to turn up and participate in meetings. Bryan suggested that his observations could be explained by viewing the vote as a share in political power, a share whose value was greater the smaller the community. He also speculated that the more valuable a vote was, the stronger the incentives insiders would have to exclude others, since they would have correspondingly more to lose from the introduction of additional voters. Now, if a vote is a share in the power of the state, it is clear that citizens of classical Athens held some very valuable shares. As well as being small by modern standards, Athenian democracy was direct, and the Athenian state had considerable military power. Citizens would no doubt have been wary of letting outsiders participate in their politics, since by doing so, they would have diluted their own considerable voting power. In the late 4th century, though, both Athens' democracy and its military power were dealt a number of severe blows by the Macedonians. The key structural change was the emergence of large, rich, and aggressive states in the wake of the campaigns of Alexander. This led to Athens' defeat by Antipater in the Lamian War, which demonstrated that Athens was no longer a first-rate power, as well as to the imposition of a property requirement for political participation. The result of this was that two of the key factors determining the value of Athenian citizenship, that's the level of democracy and the power of the state, both declined in the same period. Crucially, when the new wealth-based criteria for political participation were introduced, those deprived of their political rights continued to be citizens. This broke the link between citizenship and political power and led to a severe reduction in the value of Athenian citizenship. The instability of Athenian politics in this period didn't help, since it meant that citizens could no longer foresee what kind of power their membership in the Athenian political community would get them in a few years' time. We might well have predicted that all this would lead to weaker incentives for citizens to exclude outsiders, and an increasing number of outsiders in the antechambers of Athenian citizenship. And the antechambers of Athenian citizenship is, if I do say so myself, a very good way of describing the city's associations. As Stephen Lambert has argued, a number of associations were involved in mediating access to Athenian citizenship. This was certainly the case with demes, membership in which was more or less equivalent to citizenship, but also extends to phratries, of which all Athenian citizens were members. But Lambert has also suggested that involvement in groups of orgiones, and thiasoi in particular, could give a man a strong prima facie case for inclusion in a phratry, and hence in a deme. In other words, membership in certain religious groups could eventually lead to full citizenship and to political rights. It should be no surprise, then, that we have very little evidence for non-citizen membership in these groups in the classical period, when to be an Athenian citizen was to be part of a privileged and powerful few. It should also come as no surprise that it is in orgiones and thiasoi that we first see non-citizens being integrated, once the value of citizenship has started to nosedive in the late 4th century. These two types of groups dominate our list, accounting for 19 out of 44 of our pieces of evidence, or no less than 43%. We even start to see genuine non-citizen involvement in demes from the late 3rd century on. Remember number 30 on our handout, dated to sometime after 236, which shows foreign soldiers and Athenian citizens cooperating in Eleusis. In the classical period, citizens had strong incentives to make sure that outsiders didn't get anywhere near membership in demes, since allowing them to do so would have meant granting them access to the few valuable shares in Athenian power, which was then at its peak. By the 3rd century, the capacity of the Athenian state was limited, and access to that power by citizens had been curtailed. In such circumstances, why not let a few outsiders in? If my theory is right, what might it tell us about Athenian society? I began this paper by mentioning recent work by the likes of Lassopoulos and Vaima that seeks to move beyond the exclusiveness of the polis as a political community by looking for spaces in which citizen-non-citizen distinctions broke down. And this may well have happened in various contexts. If we're open-minded about the forms that interaction took, there is plenty of evidence for informal cooperation between citizens and non-citizens. But joint activity of this sort was not a feature of classical Athens' formal associations. At least, If we're looking for evidence of citizens and non-citizens sharing full membership of formal associations, we're going to come away somewhat disappointed. The evidence for cooperation on that level in the classical period is not good, and this might suggest that whatever social interaction went on between citizens and non-citizens in democratic Athens, such fraternization stopped at the gates of the city's formal associations. Now, I have suggested that this can be explained by a peculiarity of Athens' social and political structure, that various groups whose primary nature was religious or civil were nonetheless linked to political participation by controlling access to Athenian citizenship. If the Assoi and Orgiones were exclusive during the classical democracy, this was not necessarily because classical Athenian society was exclusionary, but because its political institutions were exclusionary, and primarily religious and social groups were not cleanly distinguished from those political institutions. Formal associations, then, may constitute an exception to, rather than a paradigm or test case for, the rest of Athenian society. And they may do so because, along with their primarily social or religious purposes, they also had a political one in vetting possible citizens. Now, the peculiarity of this situation should make us hesitate before looking for any implications for the study of civil society and democracy more generally. If Athens' political institutions had been more inclusive, it would not have mattered that its citizenship procedures created a sort of political bridgehead into Athenian society. Similarly, if Athens' associations had been kept distinct from its political institutions, then formal associations would not have become an exception to the more inclusive norm of Athenian society, an inclusiveness typified perhaps by more informal groups like our washers. Still, that the linking of political and social groups allowed Athenian political culture to reach its exclusionary hand into Athenian society might cause us to pause for thought, at least. We are used to thinking that increasing interaction on a social level leads to an opening up of political institutions, and perhaps in other cases it has. What the case of Athens may suggest instead is that political exclusiveness, far from being broken down by social inclusiveness, may actually under certain conditions counteract it. Modern democracies, which tend to have much more inclusive franchises than Athens did, have little to fear on this front. But for historians of democracy, the Athenian case may serve as a reminder of the importance of a broad franchise, not only for political reasons, but for social ones too. Athenian democratic society may not have been quite as oppressive to non-citizens as we once thought, but along with the liberalizing effects of democratic ideology, there were also the exclusionary incentives generated by voting, incentives that reach down into groups which, we might now complain, should have had nothing to do with politics. All of which explains the curious and discomforting phenomenon described in this paper, in which non-citizens emerge as full members of Athens associations only when its democracy has started to decline. Thank you.